Hello, and welcome to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 39. We are continuing our Advent series this week, focusing on the theme of joy through the prophet Zephaniah. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or a review on Facebook. If that's not your thing, would you mind sharing the post about this episode or another episode you've enjoyed on Facebook, or tell your friends? We'd love to expand our audience. All right, let's jump into this episode looking at joy in Zephaniah. All right, Brian, welcome back to the Bistro.
Hey, how are you doing, Ryan?
I'm good. Did you have a good Thanksgiving? We're recording this shortly after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, we did.
You good? And did you have the turkey?
We did. I made a turkey, big turkey, 25-pounder.
Oh,
yeah.
my gosh.
We like leftovers. We make turkey pot pie. There's this sandwich we make called turkey slop, which just tastes much better than it sounds.
I was going to say, that sounds wretched.
But no, I had a good time. Had the family over, and it was very nice. So,
okay.
How about you?
It was good. We're actually doing some more of it with my side of the family this afternoon.
Nice.
So
you look very Thanksgiving today. Very fally.
What? Because I have a flannel on that's red and black.
Yeah, that's red. I thought that was orange.
Epistemology. How do we know what we know? Anyway, so wait, we gotta go. But before we go on to what we're actually here to talk about. Turkey slop.
So you take the leftover turkey and you put it in a pan with some salt and some butter, and I mean everything's better with butter and some bread. Put it on toasted buns, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, but is this like a Johnson family recipe?
It came from a sister-in-law of mine, and we've made it since I was a kid. I think I may have. I don't remember this, but I think I may have named it. I think I called it like turkey slop. Like for our kids though, interestingly, it's almost like they would rather have that than the turkey itself. It's like such a part of Thanksgiving for them. So
you should work on naming.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm horrible. I can't name sermons well. I'm horrible at naming podcasts. Anyway, turkey slop.
Turkey slop. We're drinking good coffee.
Yeah, I see your mug says everyone is entitled to my opinion. Is that?
And I
said that was one of the most Scott Server things ever. And you said your parents gave that to you, right?
Yes. And who did you just call me?
Ryan Server things. I apologize. I called you by your brother's name. We can cut that part out.
No. I don't think he listens anyway.
Okay.
So
what I originally said was the most Server thing ever. So.
Yes. Anyway, for all of us that we've dug into our family histories a little bit here. So we've got turkey slop, misnaming of me, and my cup. Let's talk about, we're in the third week of Advent.
And you know what? I was thinking about this. I'm really glad we're doing this. I think it's good. You know, we talked about often we prepare for Christmas with the family. You know, it's, already, like I said, like you said, Thanksgiving was this week for us. So Black Friday is a big deal for people. They start shopping. They start, figuring out gifts and decorating and all this kind of stuff. The Christmas music starts, and lots of people prepare for the season in that way. But I think it's good for us to prepare spiritually. So I'm kind of glad we're doing this series. It's been fun to prepare, and we're looking at the prophets, as I mentioned, out of the lectionary. We've looked so far at the idea of hope and then love. And then this week of Advent, the third week of Advent, is the one often associated with joy. Mm-hmm. In fact, back into the Latin, when the church primarily used Latin for their services, this week is sometimes called Gaudete Sunday or Gaudete. It means joy or to rejoice is literally what Gaudete means, and it's the beginning of the Latin Mass has this idea of rejoicing from Philippians 4, and we're going to see in the scripture we're looking at today out of Zephaniah, the word rejoice is there as well. But it's interesting because in the middle of Advent's a pretty dark time, as I've mentioned. I think I said this idea that Advent always begins in the dark. That's a quote from a preacher that used that, and the idea that it's preparing for the light to come. Mm-hmm. And so it's a dark time. It's a pretty heavy time. It's a time of thinking about the darkness in ourselves and in the world around us. But gaudete, in the middle of that, or the idea of rejoicing in the middle of that, is this kind of celebration in the middle of Advent. It's remembering, we've said Advent is remembering when Christ came the first time as we celebrate at Christmas, but it also is looking forward to his second coming. And in both of those times, it's recognizing the reality of the darkness of the world and the need for salvation that the world has, like we talked about last week with Malachi. But at the same time, it is also looking forward to what that means when redemption comes. And so the celebration part of it, I think, is associated with that. And so, it's kind of a neat time. And we're looking at Zephaniah 3 today as we continue through the prophets and talking about rejoicing in the midst of Advent season.
Yeah. And again, you said you're glad we're doing this. I'm very glad that we're doing this as well. I think it's oftentimes we don't focus on some of the Old Testament stuff.
Right.
We're in the New Testament, and when Jesus comes, and just to, again, I think I said this in the first episode, just to see this narrative of hope, and enjoy, like the pieces of Advent all the way through Scripture.
There's a long trajectory of this. This isn't just something that happens out of nowhere. It's a long preparation. It's a long thread that we can kind of trace back through the Old Testament. I think it helps us recognize what God was working on then and what he was leading us toward and what we have available to us now. I think it's a kind of a cool thing to think about. I was just thinking about the darkness thing, and we haven't really mentioned this yet, but if some people have seen maybe these pictures of Advent wreaths that have 4 different candles on it.
Yeah.
And that's another part of this is you light, if your church uses the Advent candle, you light one candle every Sunday. And so again, it kind of starts darker and it gets brighter. Looking forward to the coming, obviously, the true light, as John says, the light that was coming into the world, that the darkness tried to overtake it, but it could not. And so it's kind of a cool time to think about those things. Zephaniah mentioned we're going to look at one of the minor prophets, and Zephaniah is a pretty dark prophecy as well. It's pretty heavy, kind of like Advent. In fact, Zephaniah chapter 1 begins with just a real kind of a judgment tone, like a real warning of judgment, really focused on the entire world. The judgment is going to come into the world, and kind of a really negative tone throughout the entire thing. Historically, it's set during the time of King Josiah. Do you remember Josiah? So we're getting toward the end of the southern kingdom, toward the end of Judah. The northern kingdom is already gone. Is what we called Israel during that period of time has already been destroyed by the Assyrians. But this is during the reign of King Josiah, who's one of maybe the last fourth to the end of the kings of Judah, something along those lines. But do you remember anything about Josiah? Does that name ring a bell to you?
It absolutely does ring a bell.
I'm putting you on the spot.
You are, and I love it when you do it. I love it when you do it.
I know you do. The Josiah, the kind of the Sunday school version of the story is he took the throne when he was very young, 8 years old or so, something like that, and eventually led kind of a religious revival in restoration of the southern kingdom for a period of time. Now, it was after his reign, it was relatively short-lived. So Zephaniah is writing within 50 years or so of the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon, and so we're getting toward that period of time. And so he's warning, it's a period of warning. Probably he's writing, it says in chapter 1, verse 1, he's writing during the reign of King Josiah, but probably before that religious kind of reformation or that religious revival had taken place in the land. And so he's warning people about the way that they're going. He talks about them being selfish and self-indulgent and all these kind of things. And so has a really negative tone. But then interestingly enough, so we're talking about rejoicing.
Right.
Interestingly enough, the first couple of chapters and even into the beginning of chapter 3 have that tone. But then in chapter 3, all of a sudden, it's kind of like Advent. You have this breaking in of rejoicing, basically saying, when all of this stuff is wiped out, when the judgment comes, and I'm going to introduce this term. It's a very important term for the Old Testament, remnant. When this remnant returns then. So he's going to, Zephaniah is kind of looking beyond. One commentator that I was reading about Zephaniah said that in terms of the percentage of the words of the book, that Zephaniah has more predictive prophecy than almost any of the other minor prophets, that it's very much focused on this future destruction, in order to bring judgment, but then the future beyond that, when God is going to bring back. And so I'm going to tell you two words that are associated with this prophecy of Zephaniah, especially this chapter 3, is gathering and this idea of a remnant. So what is that? When I use the term remnant, what does that make you think about? Or I
the leftovers. What's left?
What's left? Okay, and we often will use the term righteous remnant. This idea of that God is so the people are going to be scattered because of the Babylonian captivity, because it's going to be destroyed. It's judgment because they've gone far away from God. So this is the judgment that's being brought upon them. And then they're going to be brought back from the lands that they've been scattered to. So this idea of gathering, that they're going to be brought back together. And the ones that are going to be brought back together isn't going to be everyone. It's going to be the remnant. It's going to be that part, and especially the righteous remnant. So it's kind of like, all those who are leading people far away from God are going to be done away with. And then the ones that are gathered back together are the ones who are willing to do what's right. In fact, we're going to start. The text today really is, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you, Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. But look just above that. Just look at read Zephaniah chapter. So this isn't this is all bonus material. Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 11 through 13. Just read that part, because that really, this is one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament that give us the idea about what that remnant is all about.
Okay. This is the NIV. On that day, you, Jerusalem, will not be put to shame for all the wrongs you have done to me, because I will remove from you your arrogant boasters. Never again will you be haughty on my holy hill. But I will leave within you the meek and humble. The remnant of Israel will trust in the name of the Lord. They will do no wrong. They will tell no lies. A deceitful tongue will not be found in their mouths. They will eat and lie down, and no one will make them afraid.
Okay, so several things there. So you see that on that day, future oriented. But then it says, you're no longer I'm not going to allow the haughty and the proud to be there anymore. They're going to be done away with. But instead, the meek and the lowly, right? That kind of an idea. And it says, my remnant, the leftover parts, like you said. I guess Thanksgiving, the leftovers, right?
Is this
the turkey slop,
the Israel slop,
right?
I know it's terrible.
Yeah,
that's terrible.
That's
I was going to say it. I shouldn't have said it. Strike that from the record.
But anyway, the leftover parts is what we have there, and so. But you notice it says they're not going to be liars. They're not going to be proud. They're not going to be haughty. This is the righteous part. So he's bringing back, and as I've said before, we got to remember this both with Israel and also with us as God's people today, is that God intends, the reason it's so important that we're righteous isn't for our own sakes, but God intends to use us for his purposes. And so this remnant is going to be better suited in order to accomplish the purpose that God has for them, is the idea. So that's kind of what we're going into. And then, so here's the celebration part of it. This is 14 through 20. Let's kind of look through this. Just read verse 14 for me. And I want you to notice the verbs here as you read verse 14.
Okay. Sing, daughter Zion, shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem.
Okay, so there's 4 verbs there. It's sing, shout, be glad, and rejoice. And so all those have that kind of character. There's the rejoice word that I was telling you about earlier, but this idea, all those verbs have to do with celebration or joy, this expression of celebration of what God is doing in the world. And so that's kind of a recognition of what we have going on here. There's 2 words there. Daughter is used twice there. Do you notice daughter of Zion and daughter Jerusalem are both used? Daughter would be a term of endearment. If you think about your daughter, someone you want to treat with care and gently and this kind of thing. And so it's an expression of God's love for his people, that he's going to treat them like a daughter. Zion, of course, is the mountain in Jerusalem. So these are kind of interchangeable terms, but daughter of Zion. Let me tell you, this time of year, one of the things that we do, this is a little bit off the subject, but one of the things that we do in our household to prepare for Christmas, one of my favorite pieces of Advent music, and it's Advent music, is Handel's Messiah.
Oh yeah,
and this time of year we love to break that out. In fact, the other day we were listening to it, and even as we're cooking Thanksgiving meal and this kind of thing, Handel's Messiah. Handel wrote this piece of music and used primarily scripture, and so there's one of the songs that's called "Rejoice O daughter of Zion, if you'll remember. Now, it's not from this text. That's actually, he used Zechariah. I think Zechariah chapter 9 is what he's using in that text. But it's that same kind of an idea. Zechariah and Zephaniah here have very similar language when they're talking about God's bringing his people back. And the way, again, you think about the way you'd care for a daughter, the way that you would, provide, and the way that you would be gentle again with a daughter. All of these things is kind of what the prophet is giving us here. This idea, and it has to do.
And that language is used quite a bit throughout Scripture. Even the Israel when they're coming out of Exodus is called son. They're called sons.
Right.
We're adopted as sons and daughters later in Paul's writing. So
absolutely. Yeah. So daughter of Zion, daughter of Jerusalem. Here, these terms of affection is the way that I would say it. So read verse 15. Then we'll kind of do this a verse at a time, or a verse or two at a time.
The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm.
Okay, so this idea that your punishment's been taken away, so it's judgment up to this point. This idea of your judgment comes because of your turning away from God, but at that time, on that day, your punishment will be taken away. There's no longer any need to fear because, and here it is, presence. We'll come back to this again in a little bit later, but the Lord is with you. The King, the King is with you is the idea. This Messiah that's promised. So go ahead. This 16 goes along with this idea of fear as well.
Yeah. On that day, they will say to Jerusalem, "Do not fear, Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp."
The idea of hands hang limp here is I thought it would be important to talk about this image. It's a little bit like if you think about weakness, like we use this term for fear, saying, I got weak in the knees, like when something happens and you kind of feel like you're going to fall. And it's the same kind of an idea with your hands having weakness, like, somebody startles you and you drop, whatever, your 25-pound turkey you're carrying or whatever. But it's that idea of fear. And so he says there's no longer any need for that. There's no longer a need to be afraid. And so then verse 17 talks about the reason for this. There's four things I want you to see here in this passage as well.
The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love, he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing.
Okay, so there's rejoicing again, but this is interesting. It's not God's people rejoicing toward God, but it is God rejoicing over his people. And again, you think this idea of the righteous remnant, the other word that is there is delight. He will delight in them. And so there's, he wants this people. He wants this people who are doing the things that he's called them to do and are taking a part and partnering with him, we could say, in his work of redemption. And so he's going to delight in them. The other thing is, again, we have that idea of presence, that he will be with them, which is a very important part of this. In fact, at this time of year, one of the titles that we use for Jesus that we associate with the birth of Jesus, the first coming of Jesus, the Advent, is Emmanuel, which literally means in Hebrew, God with us. And so that idea of his presence in our midst. Of course, that's Jesus' promise as well, looking forward to the second coming. And I will be with you till the very end of the age, right?
Right.
I'll be with you all the time is the idea that his presence is with us. Whenever we're gathered, for example, Paul talks about the Spirit of God. John talks about that I will send another comforter to be with you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will not leave you alone. So we have this promise of presence. And that's what we see there in Zephaniah, that God is going to be with his people, which is the promise from the beginning. In fact, that's what we had at the garden, and that's also the promise at the end in the book of Revelation, obviously, is that God will be with them, he will be their God, and they will be his people. So presence, delight, and then also that word love, I think, is important, that his love is going to be expressed to them again. Last week, when we were talking about Advent in the second week of Advent, we kind of saw, and I talked about, it's kind of an odd connection between judgment and love, right? This idea of asking for obedience, but yet that's all tied up together in what it means to be God's people. Is that if we love him, then we show our obedience to him as well. And here, this idea that for his remnant, he's going to show this love for these that are, and I would say, as Christians, we believe those who are made righteous because of Christ will be shown his love and his delight, and he will rejoice over us. Now, here's the last part, verses 18 and 19. Then go ahead and finish this
Yeah.
out.
I will remove from you all who mourn over the loss of your appointed festivals, which is a burden and reproach for you. At that time I will deal with all who oppressed you. I will rescue the lame. I will gather the exiles. I will give them praise and honor in every land where they have suffered shame.
Okay, so we're talking again. We're looking forward to, and keep it open. We're going to read verse 20 in just a minute, but we're looking forward to this idea, or I should say looking forward, but in the future, there's going to be this idea that Babylon's going to come in, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, the temple's going to be destroyed. So this idea of the appointed feasts are going to be, there's no longer going to be this time that they can come up together into Jerusalem in order to participate in these important times of worship to God. And he talks about the burden and the shame of this, that in fact, again, in Isaiah and other places, Jeremiah that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, you find this language that when people see what happens to Jerusalem and when they see what happens to Judah, they're going to be kind of saying, what is it about this people that this terrible catastrophe took place, So this shame and this burden, he says, is going to be taken away then. That's going to be removed. And again, this idea he's going to bring them back and is going to delight in them. So Zephaniah ends then. This is the very end of the book of Zephaniah. It ends with this note of hope and this note of restoration, again, which we've talked about the whole time as a part of this theme of Advent, is looking forward to and recognizing what God is going to do. We recognize we're not there yet, but we look forward to what we're going to have in him. So go ahead with just verse 20.
At that time, I will gather you. At that time, I'll bring you home.
Okay, so go ahead.
I will give you honor.
Sorry.
I will give you honor and praise among all the peoples of the earth when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes.
So that idea of restoration is
says the Lord.
Let
me finish it.
That idea of restoration is what's being talked about here. This idea that this is what we had to look forward to. This is what the Messiah is going to bring us. So we're looking forward to this idea of restoration. So our hope is placed in the Messiah, and we're trusting that he is going to bring these things. Even in the midst of knowing that destruction may come, still God promises this restoration for those who are his people. He will make us right. He'll give us this hope. So any thoughts on this? Anything you notice here in this?
Yeah,
in this passage?
it's, and I think this kind of goes back to the love and justice thing that we've talked about,
Right.
That this combination of what does love have to do with justice, and that, God is bringing them all back together. And it reminds me a little bit of Revelation in some ways,
absolutely.
that there is justice, but there is the love there, and he is gathering the remnant together, those who have remained faithful, because we talk about in Revelation, it talks about the martyrs and how long, O Lord, and he's saying until the full number, and I'm going to gather you all together. So I think it's and I'm loving going through this Old Testament to look at Advent and to see that the promise is, we talk about the faithfulness of God. It's this recurring theme that he comes through and what he's bringing.
Absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned that gathering, like I was talking about earlier, the scattering and gathering. I'd like to do something on this. I have never written anything on this or really talked about this a lot, but I've kind of mentioned it in passing. But scattering and gathering is the normal pattern for God's people. If you think about it, it's interesting. If you go back even into the garden in a way, you have, them gathered there, God has his people there, but then in their disobedience, they're scattered, but then, they become gathered and scattered over and over again is this kind of an idea. And it's the same with Babylonian and Assyria. They scattered God's people. God brings them back together. The way that we see this in the New Testament, for example, you might remember, is it chapter 9 where we have the stoning of Stephen
and Acts.
What did I say?
You just said in the New Testament. You didn't say Acts.
Sorry,
Yes.
Acts chapter 9. Thank you.
We're just like in chapter 9. Chapter 9 of New Testament.
Yeah, Acts chapter 9. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Stoning of Stephen. But then it says after that, was it or 7? I can't remember. Anyway,
He's stoned in Acts.
in the book of Acts.
Yes.
But then after that, it talks about that the people are scattered, again, and as they go, they carry the message of the gospel. So it's a normal kind of pattern. And even, we see this even with God's people since the biblical period of time, that there from time to time, people are scattered they move to different parts of the world, and as they go, they carry this message of hope with them, the message of the gospel, and God uses that scattering. It's a lot like, and here's the comparison I would make. It's like seed time and harvest that we say, or planting and harvest. That when you scatter, you sow the seed by scattering it, right? Mm-hmm. And then you harvest it, you gather it in. You gather into barns and these kind of thing. And so that's kind of the constant pattern. Fits with the pattern of the world, the way that God created it, I think, and is part of the way that He's promoting His work. In the midst of all this, I'll just finish with this thought. Well, we can talk more if you want. I'm not trying to say, oh, we'll finish.
Okay, no, we're done. Okay, apparently.
But this idea of remnant, I think, is important for us today. If you think about the so what part of it, because we can become discouraged. And I know many congregations, my own included, the attendance is not what it was before this pandemic took hold and before things happen. And there's lots of different reasons people point to. We become discouraged, but we need to remember that this is not an unusual thing for God's people. That when we go through these periods of chastening sometimes and these periods of difficulty, then God continues to work through those who are still faithful. There, right? And the remnant, we could say, it's not like even, well, I don't know why this just came to mind, but the idea that God doesn't always need the full number of people in order to accomplish His purpose. But so just a word of encouragement, I think, there for us in the midst of the time we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Anything else you notice in this passage, or anything else you want to talk about?
I think that's good, and I think the real moral here is to be the turkey slop. Be the delicious after remnant. Delicious remnant.
I was going to say this at the beginning. I should have. I'm normally kind of a joyful person. That's kind of.
I call Brian. Brian's like an Eeyore. Like you go, Brian, how are you doing today? I'm okay. So if Brian says like, hey, how you doing today, Brian? He's like, okay. You go, wow, this guy is like having a great day. Like, yeah, he won the lottery.
So yeah, rejoicing is not my normal attitude.
My name's Brian.
But it is good for us to reflect on what God has done. And I think it does. We do have reason to rejoice. We do have reason to be. And I do. I'll admit, I tend to look on the negative side of things. But this is a good reminder for us. Even in the midst, Zephaniah, very negative, dark book. In the midst of that is the rejoicing because of what God is doing. And what, our trust in Him is not because of the other things happening around us. It's because of Him. Yeah, and because of what He's doing in us.
Yeah, and in spite of what's going on around us, there's news. Yeah, all kinds of evil and things happening in the world.
We'll even talk about that more next week. I think,
but there is reason to rejoice.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yes. Yeah. May your turkey slop be delicious and your Bibles read.
Absolutely.
Sign off. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Our Advent series continues next week as we explore the theme of peace by looking at Micah. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com. You can find us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Bible Bistro. And as always, you can subscribe to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Just search for Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next Tuesday.